Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on because we are tight for time now. So we've debated about biosecurity and food safety. Let's just do a little conversation about the opportunities, or should I say challenges of Brexit. Let's put it in that context. So I'm really delighted now to welcome to the stage Dr. Robert MacLean of Squire Patton Boggs, who give us an insight. And I hope you can then interpret your view of Brexit so we can have a constructive debate. Robert, over to you.
I go back and forth. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much to the Fresh Produce Consortium for inviting me here today to discuss the issue of Brexit. I'm based in Brussels, so I have a certain different perspective perhaps than most of the people from the UK, but certainly I would like to include some perspectives from the Brussels angle or the European Union's angle towards the Brexit process, as well as considering the UK's position. As you know, Brexit is very much a hot potato subject these days. It seems almost certain that the UK will leave the European Union, and the only open question is whether it will be a hard or soft Brexit or something in the middle. The process of detachment from the European Union will unquestionably create both risks and opportunities for trading with the United Kingdom. And it's a complicated process. And as you know, the picture keeps changing almost on a daily basis. This leads to an uncertainty that if this happens, then that will happen. If some model is used, that this will happen, this will be implications. And of course, uncertainty is a terrible thing for business. So what is the problem about both sides negotiating a clean Brexit? First of all, it's never been done before. No member country's ever left the European Union. Secondly, there are 45 years of economic, political and legal integration to unravel for the United Kingdom to become an independent trading country. And third, and I don't want to be political, but the UK government seems to still have an issue about grappling about what it wants in terms of a future relationship with the European Union. It knows what it doesn't want. It doesn't want free movement of people from other countries in the EU. It doesn't want to participate in the EU single market. It doesn't want to pay anymore to the EU budget, and it wants out of the common agricultural policy. On the other side of the channel, the EU 27 also has its own negotiating red lines. First of all, it needs to maintain the absolute integrity of the EU 27 as it remains, because if the UK exit is simple, then it might encourage the departure of other member states. Secondly, the EU wants to reject the notion of cherry picking, which is where the benefits of membership of the EU is translated across to the UK and therefore gives an advantage without having the obligations. There's also the issue of Ireland. So there's considerable distance between both sides on the subject of the future relationship. I'll just see if this works. So, yes. In summary, there are several possible high-level scenarios. First of all, you could have a hard Brexit. What does that mean? That means at the end of March next year, the UK falls out of the EU. And that means we would trade on WTO terms. The second possibility is a free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Third possibility is a customs union between both sides. At the moment, we don't really know exactly where we're going to be ending, but we do have some idea with the timeline. And the picture so far, or the situation so far, we know, the Article 50 letter notification has been sent in. That sets the time ticking, and for sure the UK will leave the European Union on the 30th of March 2019. There's also this discussion about this draft withdrawal agreement, and basically that's an attempt to try to freeze the position of the United Kingdom in the EU for an additional 18 months, taking the effective departure of the UK to the end of December 2020. But that deal, the withdrawal deal it's called, is only 75% complete. In other words, there's still a lot of work to be done there. There's very, very difficult issues still to resolve, and it's by no means certain that withdrawal agreement will be agreed. And there hasn't been any significant progress on the withdrawal agreement since March 2018. To give some more guidance, the EU Council, in its negotiating guidelines, said what it wants. It wants there to be a balanced, ambitious and wide-ranging free trade agreement, FTA, between the UK and the European Union. But it has to be on the basis of a level playing field. And the agreement can only be finalised and concluded once the UK is not a member state anymore. But it can't be the same as membership. It has to be something different and something less beneficial. The next major milestone is the EU Council Summit at the end of this month. That summit was established in an attempt to try to formalise the UK's withdrawal obligations and arrangements. As I said, it's unlikely to formalise the terms of the UK's departure now. And without that negotiation, without the withdrawal agreement being finalised at that summit, there'll be a pushback for another 3 months. And the next EU summit is in October. What does that mean? It means that even if we manage to make significant progress by October of this year, we would only have 6 months to finalise the final arrangements before the March 30th deadline kicks in. So generally speaking, both sides have left things a little late, to be honest. And the perception I have, reading the media, is that, thank you, is that there's an expectation that the rabbit will be pulled out the hat at the last moment. There'll be some miraculous coming together of the minds because everybody will panic. The UK is a big market, so the EU probably wants access. The UK will have to concede a little bit more, but there's some, in other words, extreme difficulties will push the two sides together. But I'm quite sceptical, if I'm honest. So what does that leave us with? We have to look a bit into the crystal ball for some guidance. And as I said, potentially there are 6 different models for trade agreement between the EU and the UK. The EEA model, which is the Norway model, is the most intense trading relationship that parties would have. And the trading on WTO terms would be the least intensive. And this is explained not by me, but by the European Commission, who set up this diagram to explain the process. So let's have a look. Key to understanding this diagram is to say where the red lines, set mainly by the UK, prevent a particular type of arrangement. So we can see that, for example, no free movement knocks out the option of the Norway model, also the Swiss model, etc., etc. And we end up falling back to only 2 potential models. That's a customs union and a free trade agreement. The only other option is departure and trading on WTO terms. So basically, in summary, the way that the parties have set up the red lines means that other options are no longer really on the table. We're only falling back onto 2 potential possibilities, a free trade agreement or a customs union agreement. Voila. So that's it. That's how we certainly see things. So let's look at a potential free trade agreement. What would it look like? A free trade agreement would remove the customs duties on trades in substantially all goods between the UK and the EU, and that's required under the WTO rules. Goods would have to fall into a preferential market access scenario to be entitled to move. In other words, you couldn't just take peanuts from the United States, bring them into the UK, and then move them to Europe, because you have to have an originating factor to qualify for free movement under a free trade agreement. There will undoubtedly be customs controls introduced in the UK-EU border, and there will be additional regulations and controls at the borders for other products, including fresh produce. Some of that paperwork could be resolved if the parties agreed some kind of mutual recognition agreement. In other words, the standards in the UK were equivalent to the standards in Europe and vice versa. But that's all to be negotiated. So the Commission itself is saying, well, as things stand, all we can offer the UK at the moment is the Canada-EU CETA model. So what the Commission is saying is that this will be the legal structure. Basically, according to the Commission, the Canada FTA will sit at the heart of the new relationship, and other pillars of the new relationship would deal with market access and customs cooperation. But the depth of that relationship is still to be decided, and all of this is subject to a successful conclusion of the withdrawal agreement. So that's an FTA. Second possibility, a customs union. Here the main elements are there will be one common external tariff, including the UK, effectively covering the EU 28 or 27 plus 1. For some or most fresh products coming from the UK and the EU. Potentially no customs duties in all covered goods crossing the border between the UK, but only for made in the UK merchandise. But there are other options. For example, the Turkey model. It could be used, but then developed into a more comprehensive system. But the Turkey model doesn't include agriculture at the moment. Again, border controls would have to be enforced, sanitary and phytosanitary inspections. The UK, if it participates in a customs union, may also be forced to take some of the obligations developed by the EU vis-à-vis free trade agreements with third countries, like, for example, Canada, or alternatively Korea, potentially in the future Japan, Vietnam, etc., etc. And effectively, produce leaving the UK for the EU 27 under the customs union will still have to comply with the EU safety and security regulations to be placed on that market. So diagrammatically, that relationship looks like the following. I don't have a marker on this, but basically, if we look at this side, of the situation, we still have all these regulations that would apply even if the UK was part of a customs union, vis-à-vis trade with third countries. The UK would still have to maintain the EU's rules of trade facilitation, including customs inspections. And in terms of direct sales to the UK from countries outside the European Union, there would be little effective change in customs paperwork and formalities. So then I move on to impact and opportunities, excuse me. Beg your pardon. Okay, let's start by being optimistic. And let's begin with the best case scenario for non-EU suppliers, and that would be an FTA between the EU and the UK. Okay, at the highest level, the UK under an FTA would adopt the EU's tariff schedules and commitments at the WTO level, migrate it across for a temporary period, and then it would have the option of reducing those tariff rates going forward because it would become an independent member of the WTO. So it would adopt temporarily the customs duty rates of the EU with the option later to unilaterally withdraw them. The UK would also be free to negotiate its own free trade agreements with third countries. And there's been a lot of talk about a free trade agreement with the United States as one possibility. The European Union tried to negotiate TTIP with the United States, but that just became too much of an entanglement. There was too much in that, if you ask me, too much in that agreement to ever be successful. But the UK might be able to do it in a sort of more micromanaged level, so to speak. It could also possibly re-enter FTAs with former Commonwealth countries, India, although India doesn't really like free trade agreements, but New Zealand, Australia, Canada, etc. EU anti-dumping measures would not apply in the UK. So, for example, anti-dumping measures on mandarins from China, or I think strawberries from China, etc., rice. They would no longer apply in the UK, allowing that merchandise to come into the UK without paying anti-dumping duties. There's also potential possibility to reduce some costs. Okay. Theoretically, although Richard just a bit earlier said it might not be possible because the UK is prioritising the importance of maintaining standards, but theoretically, the EU standards for health and safety could be relaxed by the UK government, reducing costs for producing exporters from outside the UK. Some EU standards equate to costs, labelling, whatever. It's a cost to the business. So labelling rules for content, composition, origin, and health, and nutritional claims would only need to be in English, for example. So it's a good start. So it wouldn't have to be in French, German, etc., etc. You could have the relaxation of the EU rules about use of pesticides and herbicides. There could be greater tolerance for produce made using GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And you could also potentially have the lifting of the stringent EU rules for packaging using food contact materials. It would also be possible for the UK to unilaterally reduce its tariffs on certain critical substances, food substances, if that requirement was necessary. The UK would be empowered again to introduce duty suspensions, which it often does for fruit juice or various different types of foodstuffs. The UK could do that unilaterally without having to ask for the approval of the European Union. There would also be new opportunities under the tariff rate quota split. This is rather complicated, but basically, a tariff rate quota, TQR, allows non-EU exporters to bring in a certain volume of fruits, produce, foodstuffs to a certain level every year. I'll give the example here of almonds. There's a tariff quota for almonds for 90,000 metric tons a year. So 90,000 metric tons of almonds can come into the EU without paying any duties. But once the 91, or the next one, the 91 ton comes in, the duties go on again. So there's duties of 8%, 10% or something. So there is that potential opportunity, that window of opportunity, normally January, February, March, or April of each year to have a duty-free quota and avoid paying the duties. But once the quota is exhausted, the normal duty rates cut back in again. Because the UK is leaving the EU, under WTO law, that tariff quota has to be apportioned between the UK on one hand and the European Union. And this creates an opportunity because last week the European Commission proposed not to do it on a population basis, but on a traditional use basis. And the best example is New Zealand lamb. Apparently in the UK, almost all New Zealand lamb, in the EU, all New Zealand lamb goes to the UK, so that lamb quota is going to be allocated mainly to the UK market. On the fresh fruit and produce side, to give some examples, we've got fresh cucumbers from outside the EU. The UK gets 56% of the total quota allocation, meaning that instead of the approximately 20% it should get on a population basis, there'll be 56% of free cucumbers until the quota is met. Same for lemons, barley, rice, and cane sugar. On the other hand, just to demonstrate the counter balance, if you like, for maize, it's gone the other way. The EU wants to keep the tariff quota for maize wholly in its hands, and the UK is getting none of that quota allocation. So that's TQR. So there is some possibility of getting some advantages post-Brexit from the allocation of TQRs. And there are a lot actually for foodstuffs. Potential opportunities under the Customs Union Agreement are more limited. Okay, under the Customs Union Agreement, as I said, the UK continues to apply the same duties as the EU for imported fresh fruit and produce. Duty rates are quite high, as we'll see in the next slide. We have the issue of duty suspensions for critical foods, which still remain part of the EU 27's competence. EU health and safety standards would remain a benchmark for trade and produce in the UK. There will be the restriction on the negotiation of free trade agreements. So in short, future new commercial opportunities are quite limited. And then coming back to the tariff rates for foods products. As you can see, these tariff rates are quite high because of the Common Agricultural Policy and the European Union's collective desire to protect its farmers. But for example, the average weighted tariff for the EU for vegetables from outside the EU is 8%, and these would continue to be maintained at the same level as under customs union model. I should mention a little pause. There's been some discussion in the media in the last couple of weeks, and it seems that the UK government is trending towards this custom unions model, either on a technical level, with using high tech to monitor the goods, or alternatively, some other system where the goods come into the UK and then get taxed, and then some kind of rebate or something works to offset that if they move to the European Union. Impacts. Okay. Under both scenarios, that's a customs union agreement and a free trade agreement, the main impact relates to logistics and shipment. Direct imports to the UK from outside the EU 27, so we're talking about Australia, South Africa, etc. Actually, South Africa is a bad example because it's got a free trade agreement. But US, for example, would be mainly unaffected. It's business as usual, coming in through a customs union agreement. You'd have the same paperwork, etc. The only difference would be that if the UK comes out of the system without having the EU's free trade agreements, merchandise coming from Canada would no longer be subject to the 0% customs duties for which it's entitled to under the CETA agreement. Same for South Africa. I think there's a free trade agreement with South Africa, etc., etc. The only possibility of that not happening would be if the EU free trade agreements were somehow rolled over to include the UK, but that's very difficult from a legal point of view. If you ask me, most of our clients are saying the same thing, because fresh fruit and produce is no different from the car business, where you've got very tight supply chains. The main problems arise when you're shipping between the EU 27 and the UK. For example, indirect shipment, produce coming from Shanghai into Rotterdam, and then warehoused or whatever, and then shipped differently in an intermodal process to London, for example, for distribution. There you would have a problem because you'd be crossing across the new UK-EU 27 barrier. The other problem is centralized EU warehousing systems and supply chains. Many companies store the produce, or products actually, in a particular location. Rotterdam's a good example, but also Antwerp, Hamburg, etc., etc. And then they send out the smaller shipments to more local levels. That's also something. If you have that interference of the border applying, then there's a problem. Why? Because EU customs formalities, paperwork, will apply to cross-border trade between the EU and the UK. No matter what anybody says, under both scenarios, there's going to have to be some customs clearance declarations. So this roll-on, roll-off system that you were speaking about before is going to be impeded in some way, or has to be a technological solution has to be found, but there certainly has to be some paperwork because of the legal implications of the departure. Authorized economic operators, that's special importers and companies who are allowed, who've been audited by the customs people and given special permissions and have a more lenient customs regime applied to them. The ones in the UK, authorized economic operators, will lose their license. And basically, there will be lack of mutual recognition between the UK authorized economic operators and those operating in Europe, and vice versa. Red tape and customs additional costs. The UK Treasury estimated, well, actually, first of all, it estimated the cost of a customs declaration would be £50 to £100. There was a report that came out last week that says it's actually much less than that. It's £20 to £50. But basically, there's going to be a cost for processing the customs clearance, and that's where the Treasury came up with this figure of 10 billion. It multiplied the individual transaction cost by the number of transactions each year, and it came up with this figure of 10 billion or something like that. Yes, and there's also an expectation that EU customs entry points, let's say France, will be, let's say, more active in inspections, creating further delays. So that's a very positive message, but I'd like to wrap up with two last points about actions that can be taken to reduce or mitigate risks in the post-Brexit world. First, there are potential actions to reduce additional costs by reviewing your supply chain, basically. In other words, deciding when things go forward, and these additional costs are created, who's going to bear them? Is it going to be the purchaser? Probably not, or the supplier. You would want to shift it. For example, supposing there's an 8% customs duty quota for vegetables, somebody's going to have to pay that 8% duty when it moves across the border from Spain to the UK. So is it going to be the importer? Sorry, is it going to be the supplier, or is it going to be the purchaser? So these things have to be sorted out. There also has to be guarantees, if you like, of timely delivery due to anticipated additional border formats and formalities and controls. We still have customs clearance and phytosanitary inspections to deal with. There'll be risks of the produce perishing because of the delays in transportation. So you should be looking at managing that risk, maybe insurance or some other way of hedging against that possibility. But basically, what we're saying to most of our clients is you have to review all major contractual terms between the buyer and seller to see where these risks are going to fall. Second and last, is a list of the contractual terms in a standard purchase and sale document that is mainly used, and I would point your attention to the clauses that are most important to review, apart from price, is limitation of liability in case of destruction of the produce because of excessive border delays, payment of the customs duties and taxes and other related charges, and of course general compliance with the laws. So I thank you very much for your attention to this presentation, and I'm happy to take any easy questions if you have any. Thank you.
So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, questions for Robert? Sorry, Sean, just middle left.
Simple. What about the pound against the euro? Because at the end, I think the final customer will pay for the duty and everything, like always happen. Yeah. But with the depreciation of the pound, that will be the main handicap.
Well, yes, you're completely correct. But I think you'd have to buy some hedging instruments, or go to the bank and see that. But that's it happened with the Brexit vote. Immediately, the pound fell by 10%. So I'm not an economic expert, but I think you're right. The pound will lose value against the euro. Therefore, it's not so interesting for European farmers or whatever to sell to the UK, because it would get a smaller price. It will also have a knock-on effect on inflation. But basically, with the currency risk, you really have to look at hedging as a possibility to try and mitigate that. But some banks won't want to do that because of the extreme risk involved.
Yeah, but the hedging is good to consolidate the sale. But if the pound at the moment is weak, the retailers keep the advertisement with the same prices, keeping a product like the iceberg in 39 pence or 49. You increase the logistic cost.
No, I totally agree, but that's unfortunately, I'm just a lawyer, not an economist. But it's funny, we did give a presentation 2 weeks ago at the retail group in the UK retail group. So that's Marks and Spencer's, etc., etc. And basically, what they were saying is, in that situation where you're going to get effectively less a price vis-a-vis the euro, what they're doing is they're making the Mars bars smaller. They're making the Toblerones smaller. And I said, did that apply also to clothing, for example? And apparently it does. You can reduce the quality, if you like, of the cloth, and that way you get things down. But that's the way they're looking at hedging, managing the risk of the inevitable decline of the pound once this happens.
I understand what you're saying. I think, taking your analogy, value engineering, as I would call it, if it's a manufactured product, there are a number of things you can do other than simply just making the product smaller. However, as we trade in fresh produce, it is what it is. I think what you have, though, is a commercial background of the UK retail environment being very challenging, being very competitive. And I think since Brexit, there's been huge challenges both within the supply chain, through the exchange rates and a number of other things, which I don't believe, on a personal basis, the UK consumer has seen the real cost of the decision that we've made at this time, because there's only so much you can do in the supply chain to maximise your efficiency, and then there aren't too much alternatives left. However, on a more global basis, which may be the debate we take in a few minutes, is you as a grower in another country wanting to have a relationship with the UK, it may well be at some point more attractive to trade with another country. What I'm very keen to do is highlight your concerns and others to the relevant government agencies to understand what this could do for the availability and price of food.
Yeah, huge inflation.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Because the UK government does not want food inflation.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sean, we're going to keep you running from one side, one side to the other, just over here.
Thanks, Alex von Stempel, Cool Logistics. Horror scenario. Possible that the UK suddenly would only import frozen food because it's easier and you can store it far more easily?
It's possible, yes. Yeah, exactly. With the risk of perishing of the products, and exactly, and the logistical delays are anticipated, that would be. I can see a definite trend towards.
There's already a trend
Yeah.
towards frozen because it's much more easy in the supply chain. You can calculate the risk, but with fresh produce, I think there's an additional challenge that's arising here.
I totally agree with you. I'm concerned about it, but unfortunately, I'm not the British government. Okay. Thank you very much.
No further questions. Robert, thank you very much for making a very complicated process as simple as possible to understand. We do appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert.